So you, in a trilogy of books, you make reference to the idea that you've developed something like a theory of education. And this stands in tension to the sort of omnipresent language of learning, the politics of learning, the learning society. So could you elaborate on this tension between learning and the theory of education that you've developed, and sort of draw out the content of each of these that sides of this tension?
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just thinking where to begin. I've become more and more convinced that learning and education have very little to do with each other. But the challenge is to make clear why that difference is there. One argument is to say anyone who wants to learn can learn. You don't need education for that. You can even say at one level, yeah, we are constantly learning. So why think that education is needed for learning? That already shows that there is some kind of gap. And at least it makes clear to me that the point of education is not to make learning possible. Now, one way to get then a bit more precise is that you can still say, well, let's assume that learning is a concern of education. Then you can say the job of education is to make a particular kind of learning possible. So it's about directing learning or steering learning. And there is some reason for that, some also in a very practical sense. So you can say children who live on the street learn all kinds of things, and they learn very useful things, but there are also opportunities they will never get simply because of the economic and material circumstances. So there you can say that one good argument for the school, for educational institutions, is to say at least we try to give everyone an opportunity to learn more than what they would just learn in their own situation. That you can still say sort of in terms of learning, and then you give learning a place in education. One concern I have is that when you really zoom in on the word learning, it evaporates. There is actually nothing there, I think. And again, I have a number of ways of trying to make that point. When you look at how we use the word learning, you can come up with all kinds of statements where we say, yeah, that looks like a meaningful sentence, like learning to ride a bike, learning that 2 and 2 equals 4, learning to be patient, learning that you're not good at something. But the odd thing is that if these are all cases of learning, then they are so different that you cannot assume that there is some underlying process that is the same in all these examples. That's why I just cannot understand why people say we have learning sciences or we can study learning. Maybe there are many different learnings, or we use that word to refer to many different processes. And then there are more concerns about learning. So if you ask what is learning, when do we say that someone has learned something, we basically say, well, when someone has changed in some respects. So at point A, you weren't able to do something. At point B, you are able to do something. Then you can say, oh, that person has learned something. But then we actually say not much more than that change has happened, and that we value that change or don't value the change. So then you begin to see that word learning is actually a judgment we make retrospectively. They can also say, so in the situation itself, actually, we never know whether we will change and how we will change, which also means that we can never say that we are right now learning. So for me, there are a lot of problems with the word learning, and as soon as you begin to pin it down, actually it disappears. And therefore I find it a very actually a very problematic word. I think I always, also when my students use the word, I always say, can you come up with another word that is more descriptive or more precise or helps to say what we're really talking about. But also, and I realize this has something to do with language as well, and the language in which I grew up. For me, education actually is first of all a verb, and I would say education is a form of intentional action. In English, you don't immediately get that with the word education because it can also refer to a process. But in Dutch, the words there are all very clearly sort of words that refer to the activities of an educator. And that's my other point where I think, well, education only exists when there are educators. So the focus of our theorizing should be on the work that educators do, or that they, I have this category of intentional non-action. As educators, we often also don't do something, but we do that for good reasons. So there are a lot of intentions for not doing something, staying silent or not interfering. So for me, there is a very wide gap between the discourse of learning and the discourse of education. And yeah, on the one hand, I think the word learning actually lacks precision. So each time someone uses it, I am actually not sure what they mean by it. And that's worrying because it has become so big. But I also think it's far more interesting when we are in the field of education to think about, well, what do we do as educators then? And for me, theories of education have to focus on that.